Powdery scab is currently threatening the survival of South African potato tuber producers as well as the global potato industry. Rudolph Strydom, a plant pathologist attached to the University of Pretoria, joins us now to tell us more about this potato tuber disease. Good day, Rudolph.
Good morning.
Quickly tell me, what exactly causes powdery scab?
Okay, so powdery scab can be found throughout most potato growing regions of South Africa. This disease is caused by the soil-borne pathogen Spongospora subterranea FSP subterranea, which is a mouthful, so I'll only be calling it Spongospora today. So symptoms of powdery scab is the formation of distinct scab-like lesions on the surface of infected potato tubers. When these lesions are mature, they burst open and they are filled with a powdery brown mass of sand-like spore balls, and this is where the disease gets its name from, powdery scab. So these lesions are often confused with that of common scab, but they are rounder, smaller and more uniform in their size, as well as obviously filled with spore balls. Every one of these spore balls can potentially be made up of hundreds of individual resting spores, which I'll explain later what these resting spores are. So powdery scab is not the only disease that can be caused by Spongospora. It can also result in root infection and root gall formation in its host plants. So both these root diseases can inhibit water and nutrient uptake from the soil, which can reduce plant growth and affect the final tuber yield. So this pathogen spreads through seed and soil-borne resting spores. Now these resting spores are the survival structures of the pathogen. And like I said, they can clump together to form spore balls. So these spores are spread to new fields through the planting of infected potato tubers or the movement of contaminated soil. And once this pathogen is in the soil, it's almost impossible to eradicate or get rid of because these resting spores are so long-lived. They can survive for at least 5 years in the soil and still be viable. So these resting spores will germinate under favorable environmental conditions to release zoospores. These zoospores then infect your roots, your stolons, and your tubers of your potato plants. So powdery scab disease development is most optimal under wet and cold soil conditions. So powdery scab disease is the most severe when there were high levels of soil moisture due to waterlogging or high irrigation application during the early stages of the potato growing season. Now the reason for this is potato tubers are only susceptible to infection by Spongospora during the early stages of tuber initiation or development. So a couple of weeks surrounding the tuber set period when the tubers just start to form. But the roots on the other hand are susceptible throughout the growing season, so you can get multiple cycles of infection, mass zoospore production, and this can result in powdery scab outbreaks or epidemics in your field. Then last thing I just want to mention is that these spore balls are released from the powdery scab lesions or the decomposing roots or root galls into the soil, where they increase your pathogen inoculum levels in your already infested potato fields.
Okay, so just explain a little bit more, elaborate a little bit more. In the field, is it contained to a small pot or will it go throughout your entire crop once it's in your soil?
So it initially will start in certain areas and then from there it will start spreading throughout the field, but it would be mostly unevenly spread throughout the field just because the pathogen doesn't move far. But that also depends on, if you're using infected seed potato tubers throughout your field, you're going to spread that inoculum of the pathogen throughout the field. Yeah.
Can you've researched this disease quite extensively? Won't you just tell us a bit more about what your research has taught you about the disease?
So Spongospora is a very wide host range. So it infects a lot of crop species that are often rotated, included in crop rotation programs by South African potato growers. So it's important to determine the host status of these crop species to help farmers make more informed decisions regarding the crops they select to rotate. So a lot of these Spongospora hosts we call, alternative hosts we call true hosts. So they produce spore balls within their roots, which are released into the soil. It increases the inoculum levels and it has the potential to result in severe powdery scab disease in your next potato crop. Then we of course also get non-host species, and then we get a category that we call trap crop species. So the pathogen infects these species, but they don't produce spore balls. So we could potentially use these trap crops as a management tool when we grow them in infested soils. And then another thing we looked at was there's a severe lack of effective control measures for powdery scab. So an integrated management program for Spongospora inoculum and Spongospora diseases like powdery scab is needed. So in my project, we determined the host status of 26 different rotation and cover crop species to the pathogen. This was in greenhouse trials. Then we also had a 2-year field trial where we evaluated the effectiveness of different treatment combinations at reducing Spongospora inoculum, root disease, root galling, and of course powdery scab. So the main findings were that all the species assessed in the greenhouse trial were successfully infected by Spongospora. So they were all some type of host of this pathogen. So this, supports the claim that Spongospora has a very wide host range. The vast majority was shown to be true hosts because they produce spore balls, and only 3 of them were shown to be trap crops. The other thing we looked at was the level of infection within these roots. So there weren't a significant difference between the levels of infection between the species, and overall the level of infection by this pathogen was very low. So crop rotation is often advised for potato growers to include these non-host and trap crops to prevent accumulation of the inoculum between their potato growing seasons, and then exclude the true host species. But, based on my results, this would be very difficult, or it would not be a practical solution because most species were shown to be true hosts. The only positive is that the level of infection was extremely low. So even if these species do produce spore balls, it might be in too low quantities to actually affect the level of powdery scab disease we see in the follow-up potato crop. Then in the field trials, we didn't have any significant differences between all our treatment combinations, but we can use these results to compare the effect of growing a cover crop mix containing true host and a trap crop monoculture. These were 2 of the treatments within the field trials, and there were no significant differences. So this is not definitive or conclusive, but we can speculate that, maybe the host status is not as important. Maybe it doesn't have as big an impact on the level of powdery scab we see in the field. Like I said earlier, they might not produce spore balls in large enough quantity to actually affect the powdery scab we see. So if we can, last thing I'll say is, we need, in future research, they need to investigate more these role of these alternative hosts on powdery scab in the field. If we can determine if they produce spore balls in large enough quantities, we can determine if potato growers should at all be worried about which crops they select to rotate with their potatoes. Yeah.
Okay, and apart from crop rotation, or you can elaborate on that still if you want to, what else can farmers do to manage this disease?
So powdery scab control is very difficult. There's no single effective control measure. So even with the insignificant results from my field trial, an integrated management approach that includes as many different strategies as possible is still the most viable or best solution for controlling powdery scab. So the first method I would suggest is the most effective, and that's selecting and cultivating a cultivar with high tolerance to root and tuber infection. So there is currently no commercially available cultivars that are completely immune to infection, and a lot of the market-favored cultivars are quite susceptible to powdery scab. So cultivar studies have been done in South Africa to determine the susceptibility of different cultivars to powdery scab and root galling. This was done by Professor Jackie van der Walt, and the results can be seen in a CHIPS article that was released in the July-August issue of 2015. So the farmers can find the results for those cultivar studies there. Then next, don't grow potatoes in soil that has a history of powdery scab, and prevent introduction of the pathogen by only planting certified healthy seed potato tubers. There are commercially available agri-strip test kits that are highly sensitive and for rapid on-site testing of tubers, so you can determine if they are infected by Spongospora or maybe contaminated by spore balls. Then, if possible, potato growers should plant when the soil temperatures are predicted to be higher during that susceptible period where the tubers can get infected. So you want the conditions as unfavorable as possible for infection. Then we've got crop rotation. So like I said, generally they recommend implementing a crop rotation program of at least 3 to 5 years with non-host and trap crops, and then exclude true hosts. But like we said, it's difficult because this pathogen has a very wide host range. And then also crop rotation has been shown not to be very effective in the past because these racing spores are so long-lived, so they can outlive long rotations and still be viable. Then next, we've got soil fumigation. So some chemical fumigants have been shown to be effective if you apply them before the potato growing season. But as we know, a lot of these chemicals are no longer available or they're being phased out because they're detrimental to the environment. Then next we've got chemical control. So chemical control has overall been ineffective for powdery scab, especially if you've got high levels of infestation in your field. A lot of these chemicals are also being withdrawn, and there's not a lot of incentive or motivation to develop or register new fungicides. So, there's limited chemical control available for powdery scab. Now, some fungicides have been shown to be effective against powdery scab, but unfortunately, they're not registered for that use in South Africa. Then we've got biological control. So, some biological control products that contain different species of Trichoderma, Bacillus, or Aspergillus have been shown to be effective against root infection and tuber infection in greenhouse trials. When you apply it as a seed coating or as a soil drench, in my field trials, however, we did apply a Trichoderma and a Bacillus-based product, and neither were effective at managing disease, but I would still recommend looking into biological control products. Then very important is irrigation and moisture management. So over irrigation can increase powdery scab, so try to limit that or prevent that. And then also it's recommended, if possible, growers should limit the amount of irrigation they apply during that critical period of tuber susceptibility that I mentioned earlier. Also limit the amount of waterlogging and water retention you've got in the field. So certain actions like overworking the field or compacting wet soils with heavy machinery can increase water retention. So try to minimize that as well. Then stressed plants are more prone to disease. So, make sure your soil is at the appropriate pH and your plants get the correct balance of micro and macronutrients. The over-application of high nitrogen-based fertilizers have been shown to increase powdery scab. And then when you apply manure, make sure it's thoroughly composted and do not apply manure from livestock that's been fed infected or discarded potatoes. Then last thing I want to say is, just maintain good hygienic practices. Disinfect your equipment after use so you don't accidentally spread the pathogen to new areas. Discard any potential contaminated soil or debris or dust from your equipment or your storage facilities. Yeah, so that's it. There's a bunch of different measures, so hopefully they can find some use in there.
Thank you so much, Rudolph. That is a mouthful. I would love to sum it up and say good management practices, but it's so much more than just that. So viewers, if you are interested to learn even more about powdery scab, be on the lookout in the latest chips. There is also an article that Rudolph Strydom, a plant pathologist from the University of Pretoria, wrote for us.